So I'm going to get started because this is a pretty free-flowing presentation. I'm going to initially look at the chat, but then I'm going to switch over to the Q&A tab, and I'll explain why as I go on. It's about web forms. And before we begin, say hello, which people have been doing. In the chat, you could talk about how have you used web forms? Are you new to web forms? Looking for advanced stuff? What do you want to learn today? And definitely review the slides, and you'll post your questions in the Q&A. And if people even can vote them up, I will use that. And I'll explain more how I want to handle questions. But this is Webform Choose Your Own Adventure, so it's starting to hint that you should be participating in this. My name's Jacob Rockowitz. I'm known as Jay Rockowitz on the web. I'm a Drupal developer and software architect. I built and maintained the Webform module for Drupal 8 and now 9 and hopefully 10. I actually decided to bookend this presentation with a pitch to help me work on the Webform module by either getting involved or backing the Webform module's Open Collective. I'm almost doing this pitch as I'm going to ask you at the end to join the Webform module's Open Collective. If one or two people join, this makes it worth my time. It just helps me do the work I'm doing. Anyway, I'm going to focus on the presentation. We'll come back to it. Keep it in the back of your mind. This is basically an amalgamation of all the past presentations I've done over the last 5 years. Those are links to all the slide decks. And I'm pulling in all that information so we can decide what we want to talk about. This is a slide from my first presentation, YAML, what is it good for? For anyone that knows the history of the Webform module, it started out as the YAML form module, and this was one of the first presentations about it. We can talk about YAML as we go through the deck. And I'm answering the why, what, and how questions. And these are the 24 sections. There's 120 slides here. I put stars on the sections I'm absolutely going to go to. But as you ask questions, we can bounce around and go to more advanced topics or simpler topics. And yeah, my goal is to answer your questions. I'm actually hoping this is my last virtual presentation, but I've learned that this is the key thing people can get out of it because it can be more interactive. I'm not standing in front of a podium. I am looking at the Q&A tab so I can answer your questions. And I'm actually going to move over to the Q&A tab in my other screen and allow you to start asking questions as I'm going through. And if I go back here, let you choose your own adventure. So let's get started. So this is my elevator pitch. Why use the Webform module? The Webform module is a powerful and flexible form builder and submission manager for Drupal 8 and 9. The use case is very simple, that you're going to build a form that collects data and then you're going to distribute that data. Distribute meaning whether to push it to a CRM, download it as a CSV, even just send an email is an act of distributing that information. I'm going to do a little demo. This is a clean install. And the demo I've been doing, the same demo for 5 years because it really works the best, is it's a simple contact form where I'm going to just add a company field. And now we're in the build state. We're going to go to the UI and I'm going to add an element. I'm going to add a simple text field. I'm going to call it company. There's a lot of options that we don't have to go through right now. All you need to do is say, what's the title of the element? I'm going to hit save. It adds it to the bottom of the form. Let's preview it. It says company. There's a mistake here where it should say your company. It should be required. It should be below your name. I'm going to go to the form builder. You can definitely do this in the form builder. You can move it, you can require it, you could save it, you could edit it. But this is a good opportunity to show you the source mode, where I'm going to switch over to basically the YAML markup behind the form. And this allows us to cut and paste elements and text. And so, for example, I'm moving the company element up, changing the label to your company. I'm copying a required property, and I'm going to hit save. It's been updated. Now, if I go to the test tab, so instead of view, I'm going to test. So we're previewing the form, but what it's doing is filling it out with dummy data, which gives us a nice opportunity to see how it works. If I hit send, it'll post one submission, give you a little message at the top. We're kind of done with the build phase of the demo. And now we're talking about the collecting. We've collected that information. We're going to review it. So when we go over to the results tab, and even to make it a little better, I'm going to show you, I have the Webform module, the devel module enabled, which allows us to quickly generate submissions. So I'm generating 50 submissions that will jump me to the results tab. You can navigate to it. Just helps to have some results here to show you how it works. You can review all your results online. You can flag your results. You can do bulk operations. For example, I could star all the results. I can unstar. This is a new feature. You can click through, look at the details. You can even download this information as a PDF with the entity print module installed. You can view it as a table. And so basically, you have all the possibilities to look over this data. And then once you're done with this data, you might want to export it. And the most simple way to export it is download it. And that's the second tab under results. And here's the download tab. And you have a bunch of formats. You can even download everything as PDF documents, a zip archive of every PDF. But for now, we're going to stick to an HTML table because I can show it to you on screen. I'm not going to open an Excel. You can customize every aspect of this table, but for now, I'm just going to say, don't download it, display it on screen, and we can look at all the results listed here. Okay, that's the end of this demo. And true to the nature of this presentation, I'm going to go back. We're here, and I'm going to answer some questions if they're here and they're relevant. Are submissions become a full Drupal entity, fields, and other features, or web form only objects? It's kind of a mixed answer, and it's good to ask that early on. And I can get more into it as we go on. But web forms and submissions are entities in Drupal, but they don't use fields. They use properties. So, for example, when I say that, web forms are configuration entities like views. So there's no fields for that. Um, it kind of makes sense. You're defining like a spec of how a form would work. Now, for submissions, there are modules like the workflow field module where you actually can take the workflow capabilities in core and add that as a field to a web form submission and manipulate it. But the data is stored using, it's called an entity attribute value table. Get into it further if you want to learn more, but it's a optimized way of storing a lot of data. And that's one of the challenges of web form. We're not just fields, we're storing hundreds of pieces of information. There are modules that can help you integrate submissions into entities and save them to nodes. I hope that answers that question. I'm going to keep going and I'm going to answer some other questions as we move on. Let's talk about features. And so you can see that I can click around. So what are some of the features included in the Webform module? You saw the drag and drop form builder. There's multi-column layout. You can do modal dialogues, conditional logic. You can pre-populate forms. You can also actually autofill. There's for handling submissions, you can send emails, you can remote post it. You actually can build your own custom options. And then on the right side, it's really getting into the details of submissions where you can set limits, previews, drafts, auto purging, full access controls, and sharing. And we can go into any of these features as requested. And when you get to elements, you saw there was this massive amount of elements. There's like 80 plus elements, and there's a lot of options for most elements. So we really start off with standard HTML elements, but you can go all the way to signatures, buttons, ratings, image selections, addresses, leveraging the address module. And for each input, select menus have full enhancements. So you could use, modern JavaScript libraries like select to, chosen, and choices to improve that user experience. You can also do computed values. And then for an individual input, you can have tooltips or slide outs. Text fields can have input mask, character limits, regex, pattern validation, even limiting things to unique values. And it's really important because I think people get overwhelmed when they install the Webform module that it ships with reasonable default settings, but everything is customizable. You saw in that demo when I created that single input, all I had to enter was the title. And I recommend starting out that way and then going through all the options and seeing what you need. Out of the box, it should just work fairly simple. And there's just a lot of configuration settings. And this little demo just shows you just the confirmation page where you can go in and there's 7 different ways to change the confirmation page type, message, inline. In this case, I'm just going to switch to a modal. You can redirect to an external URL. And this is a very simple example of the level of configuration that's available. Now, when I hit send, it doesn't display green message. It displays a modal message that someone could dismiss. This is a very good user experience for having someone subscribe on a page because you're not leaving them from the page. And There is a style guide. If you install the examples, Webform examples module included in core, it gives you kind of a style guide that's a kitchen sink of everything available, every example element. You can use this one to get familiar as a developer, but even for your front end themers, you can use this to when you're theming your forms, you could use this as a starting point. This is a web form unto itself, so you can customize it. So if you're not using certain elements, you can take them out. If you have custom elements, you can put them in. At the bottom, you see this is really for designers. This is just a look and feel of like horizontal rules, messages, multi-column layout, and then an example of a contrib module being integrated. That was the address at the bottom. I'm going to go continue on examples and then do some more questions. Are there good examples of web forms? Well, there's an examples module and it gives you examples what you just saw the kitchen sink. There's examples of computed elements, multi-step forms, multi-column layouts, some conditional logic, and there's a web form templates. I can go further into that if people want it, but it's like these are starter forms. These are examples of kind of ideal forms for certain use cases, and they include a lot of functionality. So for finding and choosing, just to want to emphasize, there is this preview functionality, which will give you a preview when you're selecting your elements. So you're kind of getting that style guide in line as you're choosing, reviewing which elements you want to add to your form. Computed elements, this is a very simple example where I'm just adding two numbers together, and that 35 was done using Twig. The bottom, it's tokens. So it's just pulling values based on other values. So the first one, you'll see that you got three inputs. The last one is the computation. It's just a simple Twig statement, adding two numbers together. And there's a little checkbox to say use Ajax for that. And the second one is I'm selecting a user, but then I have all these fields that go and pull that user's other information using tokens. So there's two ways to kind of do computations. And you can use tokens inside of Twig, and there's examples of that. And multi-step exists out of the box. There's a multi-step form and there's cards. Cards are kind of client-side steps. These steps, each one hits the server, has pluses and minuses. When it hits the server, you can get full validation on the server side. Um, the example kind of shows you all the functionality that's available to make sure you kind of understand you can edit, you can preview, you can warn users that they're going to lose their information. Okay, I'm going to go back to some of the questions. Um, In what way okay, this is great. In what way could I transform a web form submission into a Drupal node, like a submit event? I want to yeah, into an that's a great use case. So Sven asked that. Um, I'm going to now start jumping around because I've done enough where I'm going to answer questions and I know myself. I will get back to every single star in this presentation and I'll monitor the time. We are talking about extending the web form module because this is where there's a community of modules outside to answer that question. So add-ons are Drupal modules and projects that extend and provide additional functionality to the web form module and Drupal's form API. It's a dedicated section. I'm showing you right now the views integration, but what I'm going to do is one, highlight there's a bunch of different types, and the one we're talking about is an integration or submission handling. And I have to look, but basically the add-ons give you features to do spam protection, validation, new elements, integrations with outside systems, enhancements to submissions, then also just sending email. If you want to send file attachments, you need to install a mail handler. On the right side, we're talking about there's some REST modules to help expose web forms to REST, some migration tools, workflow, and there's even some development tools I would recommend. Now we're back here, but what I'm going to do is answer the question about how do we take a submission and create an event node. So I'm going to go over to the add-on section, and the module is called Create Content. The content creator, it's under integrations because it's kind of integrating into Drupal's node system. I'm going to open it in a new tab. And what this module does, and let's look at the screenshot, it provides, let me see. Sorry. What happened here is I thought, yeah, you see this screenshot at the bottom? This is what we want to look at. It provides a way to map your submission data to a node. So when someone saves you have a event form, they add the event to the form, and then when that submission is created, it will populate a node of your selection. Um, This is a very popular module. It's being used. Let me just give you a quick. I like doing this for people new to Drupal. It has 900 installs, which is very good. It's been updated relatively recently. Um, and I know a lot of people using it. I definitely recommend it. And the maintainer's been fairly active. I'm going to keep going. Okay. Any plans to support or build CRM integration? We are definitely on that topic of CRM integration. Um, what how would you put the web form is just a form and submission manager, so it's not going to have very tight CRM integration. But in the add-ons, let's clear this, collapse all, and go over to integrations. There are a lot of integrations with CRM, so they're using handlers to push that data into different CRMs. Webform Civi CRM has a very tight integration where basically you can use Webform as a front end to Civi CRM forms and have it fully integrated into Drupal. But I've used it with Salesforce, and frankly, I don't use the Webform Salesforce integration. What I tend to do is write what they're called is a Webform handler, and I am going to use this as an opportunity to make that the next topic that I'll talk about. Um, and a handler just it basically triggers after you submit a form, and in a handler you can do anything. And what I do is it's very simple. I have a little curl command. It calls Salesforce. It pushes the data into Salesforce. I get a confirmation number. I put the confirmation number back into Drupal. Um, but what this is a good opportunity is to jump to handlers. And let's talk about distributing submissions because that's really what CRM integration is. So a web form handler use cases is email notifications and confirmation. You submit a form, it sends an email, push data to a CRM, or subscribe a user to a mailing list. There's also these handlers that allow you to kind of do conditional behaviors. Like you can flag a submission based on submission values. That's the oh boy, I'm going to blank and have to look it up. One's called the settings handler and one's called the action handler. So there's an action on a submission where you can basically say flag the submission if someone says this is important. And then the settings handler allows you to change things on the form as it's being submitted. And the best example is someone fills out a form and you want to conditionally change the confirmation message. For example, if they say something's important, you might want to in the confirmation message say, hey, we will get back to you within 24 hours instead of 48 hours. And these are the ones, yeah, these are the ones that come out of the box: email, remote post, actions and settings, which I just explained, and there's a debug handler, which just shows you the data as it's coming in and out. Always recommend using it when you're building custom handlers. Every handler I've created has a debug functionality. The example even includes it. The idea of a debug is if, especially we're going to see this in a second. So we're familiar with email. This is a very simple demo of the email handler where this is a contact form with radio buttons. And it just shows an advanced feature in the email handler where you could say who you want to send the email to. Then I scroll up. Oh, you can, by the way, twig all that supported in the email. You can build any type of email you want. But here you could say, I would like the recipients to be based on those options. And now you can route the submission to different users. So comments could go to comments at your company, bugs can go to bugs. It just shows you the flexibility. The email functionality out of the box is it's comprehensive. Can pose more questions about that. This is about the CRM integration. So this is the remote post handler where I have this simple contact form and I'm going to say remote post it. And I'm going to add a URL. When it's completed, I would like to take that data and put it to this endpoint. You can say what data is going to go. By default, it's just the stuff users entered because that makes the most sense of what you'd want in a CRM. This is a great example of I am enable debugging because the URL I just entered ain't going to work. It's not valid. So I'm going to submit this example. I'm going to get my debug statement at the top. It's going to tell me exactly what happened. Here's the data going out. Where's it going to? It got a 404 because it didn't exist. And this is one of the most basic ways to integrate with the CRM. I also recommend looking at the CRM integration modules. Either they work out of the box or you can use them as a starting point. Another example here is you can extend, these are plugins, you can extend them. So you can add your own authentication layer on top of it. Okay, let's keep going with the questions. Um, Do you know if paragraphs is supported by the content creator add-on? I don't know that answer. I don't know. Yeah. For example, I don't know if the content creator, I think it's mostly targeting nodes. There's decent paragraph integration with the Webform module where you can put webforms inside paragraphs. There are tickets to keep improving it, but people are definitely using it. Um, I think this question about spam, what are the different spam solutions, is a really, yes. Is there a preferred or best practice? And I'm going to jump to that. So these are the three I kind of recommend, and there's recipes for them. Honeypot, it basically puts some hidden fields, and if a robot fills it out, it knows it's a robot. Antibot uses a little JavaScript where robots tend not to use JavaScript, so then a robot wouldn't be able to submit the form. And CAPTCHA, we all know, as a good and old frustrating system. Yep, it's the most annoying, but it's the best. Honeypot can be good enough without annoying users. The last one took me years to fully catch, and it's a big one. Spam protection modules may disable page caching. If, excuse me, if you, for example, display a unique CAPTCHA question on the form, that disables page caching because that question has to generate, it has to track it for the individual user and drop a session. So you take a huge hit when you enable CAPTCHA on your site. If you do honeypot time limit, that recipe, that disables page caching because it's looking at a time. So it needs to know what time the page was rendered and what time the page was submitted. Now there are recipes. There's one that has come to mind, and I recommend always starting with this, is use honeypot and antibot. So using a honeypot field, which doesn't disable page caching, and antibot, which is JavaScript detection, you don't break page caching. It is a nice recipe. It all depends. There are more spam protection modules. There's paid services that do text analysis. Um, I've used them in the past. Molem was the one that Aqua had that was great, frankly. But most of these recipes tend to work well. What I've done is sometimes on a form that gets targeted, I'll enable CAPTCHA when that becomes a problem, but I try to avoid it. I'm going to we're at 22 minutes. I'm going to go back to going through some general information to help people because I think it also will drive some more questions and focus. I'm going to go to publishing a form because we started hinting at it. And what's important is you can create your web form entity and you can put it into a node or place it in a block, which then could go into a layout, or you can do it in custom. I want to be clear that there's a you can actually just render a web form into a page. There's a render element called web form. You enter the ID and it will just generate the web form for you. Most people use nodes and blocks. Blocks make it easy to include a web form within layouts and panels. It can be anywhere, any page, very easy to track. And yeah, it's as simple as going into, place block, select your web form. Something I didn't talk about is when you're placing forms, you can add default data, which kind of helps with user experience. You could say, well, this form let's say you're placing an event form, you could set the event date for the form. Now, for the node module, it provides a dedicated web form content type, but the reality is there's a web form field that allows you to place web form on any entity. What's really powerful about when you see the web form node module kick in is you can create one web form, place it in multiple areas of your site, and have individual submissions tracked to that web form. Um, the example for that would be an event registration system. So you could have event nodes and have a registration form, the same registration form attached to 10 events. And each time someone submits that registration form to the event, it's tracking just that registration for the single event. It allows a lot of reuse. If people have questions about that, we can go more into it. References is just ability to track all those instances. So this is just going to walk through actually the whole concept. I created a simple contact form. I have one result. It's the submitted to is blank because this form is not placed on the site. It has its own instance, but now I'm creating my own contact form, dedicated instance. You can see it's pre-populated. You can pick any form. You can set open and closing. I'm going to hit save. Now we have a node with a web form inside of it. I can go to the test tab, which is automatically added. When I hit test, it generates another submission. So we've done this twice, but when we go to the results tab of this form, we get one submission because that's the one being tracked by this form. And if we go all the way up to the main results table, that's where I'm going. I'm backing up and I click results. You'll see two submissions and you see the second one is being tracked. So you kind of really nice way to see all your submissions. Okay. I like Mark's question, which now, by the way, if it gets 3 thumbs up, I have to stop and answer. The module has tons of options. It may be overwhelming. This is why we don't give our content editors access to manage form. Is the possibility to limit options for content editors? Yes, absolutely. Um, let's see what it's a tricky one. So here's kind of the deal. Is one, everything you could use form alter hooks and strip out functionality, which I do all the time. Um, There's also a hook. I wasn't going to show code, but I feel like I'm going to need to spin up my IDE for a second, which is right here. Give me a second. I think it's a great question. And by the way, whenever I show code, I always like to caveat it and be like, I'm not showing code for more than 2 minutes here. Here, I'm going to close down, open, go into modules, and what we're going to see is in the web form, there's a lot of submodules. I know the left side is very small. You'll just have, I'll read it to you as I go through. What I'm doing is there's examples, and there's examples of element properties. And if I go into this module, what it's going to, and I will make this bigger for everyone, it shows you a couple of hooks where you can alter the element properties. So this hook is showing you, well, I'd like to say I'd like to add a custom data. So every element gets a custom data property. It's saying that custom data property can be translatable. And then when I get to a form, I'm adding the ability to edit. This example could be used to do the reverse to simplify your forms. You can strip out properties. So if you think the text field has an overwhelming amount of properties, for example, and I'm going to use this as a good example to show you all that functionality. You could say users can only enter a description. They can only use this one type of property, and you can unset those options, and they won't get them. That's one of the most simplest ways to simplify the form. When you get to those settings, that is a very hard challenge. And when I say settings, I go over to here. There's a ton of configuration settings, and most people don't need them. And one trick would be to use access, go in and alter these and just disable them for certain users in certain roles. Like you create a role of form editor and you strip them out. This is stuff we could do in Contrib, but we're not there yet. Um, okay, so we're talking. Sorry, I want to catch my train of thought on this. Um, we're talking about properties in a ways. Oh, improve the form. Oh, what I want to do is I was talking about people are asking. There's so much functionality. I kind of want to highlight some of it, and this is a good example where there's out of the box, you have the ability to add tons of labels to your elements. And for some form builders, people building forms, they don't need all this functionality. We're getting down to you can have a tooltip, a placeholder, a description, and a slide out. I want to emphasize don't do all of these. Generally, placeholders provide good guidance. Descriptive text is usually the best way to do it. A little string of text at the bottom. But the more and help have different use cases. I use the more slide out when I'm doing clinical forms and I need to give a medical description to something that's 2 or 3 paragraphs with an image. You can't show that on the form. You can just say, learn more about this, and they slide it out. And then in the web form UI, I leverage tooltips constantly. And my reasoning is exactly this. One, the tooltip is useful for the first time you visit a forum, but once you understand a forum, you don't need that information. So tooltip's the most compressed way to do it, but it's always there. Some accessibility tips is don't placeholders never replace form labels. That is an accessibility nightmare. You have to have a description, a title to your elements. And use the more and help text cautiously. And the other part, there's all these other features. You have to decide if they're valuable. You can do input masks. You can add counters. You can select the telephone info. Oh, by the way, you can turn off elements that your users don't need. I'm like regretting that I don't have slides to emphasize that. And I'm going to spend a second and point that one out. So I'm going to go up to, so at the higher level, you can do configuration for all your web forms. When you go to elements, I'm going to collapse everything and go to the bottom, and you can turn on and off your element types. I strongly recommend doing this. If you don't want users uploading files, don't let them. Out of the box, the password element is off because passwords are not, and this is actually designed to tell you they're not encrypted. So it's not a good practice to have users adding password elements to your form. It's a misconception. But you can turn these on and off. And that's, as a site builder, there's a certain responsibility where you need to walk through all these features and capabilities and decide what you do and don't want the web form module to do for you. Okay, I'm going to go back to questions. Is this shared piece of code can be used to restrict elements per role as well? Ooh, I don't, Hermit, I don't fully understand the question. I'm assuming um, restrict elements per role. I mean, we could jump to access controls, and I think that's a good, let's see, limit access to a web form. If this doesn't answer the question, I'm going to go fast, and it just helps. There's 4 levels of access controls. You can do permissions, just who can update all submissions, all web forms, who can access that YAML. I want to emphasize that is a dedicated setting. So you could turn that off for users. On forms, you can do role access. On elements, you can do role-based access. And then there are modules that actually grant kind of like grouping levels. There is a web form group module and a web form access module. They both do kind of similar things where you can say this group of people can do the can manage submissions on this web form. For enterprise organizations, it's a big feature where you have multiple departments. And permissions, these are just some of the permissions. And you can see there's little warnings about, delete any form, any submission, editing anything like CSS or YAML it's basically considered, a high level permission, or even the twig. Now, yeah, the access controls or rules are by role, user, or permission. This will just show you we're at a form. We could say who can administer web forms and select the roles, individual users, or even an individual permission to trigger it. And elements have the same level. So when I go to elements and I go to the access tab, this is so you can say I want to add an admin notes field, and only users who are administrators can access this field. This definitely creates a most easy way to create advanced kind of workflows or user experiences where admins can edit certain fields, certain users can edit others. I'm going to keep going with the question. Well, I wish I could say done, check off the question. Oh, I see a reply. So I'm going to, yeah, I think I answered the question about roles and access, and I'm going to go on to some other questions. Is it possible to have multilingual forms? Yes. There's full support for multilingual. I recommend using the 6.x branch. It has even better support. I definitely am using it in production. Many people are using it in production. There are 1 or 2 caveats. And this is a core challenge. Uh, Boy, what is the core challenge? It has a lot to do with if you start a site in one language and then change the language and then have content created in both languages, they can start conflicting with each other. They can kind of start clobbering each other. Um, I answered about spam. Um, I think I've answered a bunch of your questions. Oh, by default, is there a way to make them disabled? We use a very specific set of elements and don't want new elements to be enabled. Oh, no, there isn't. It's because we're doing a whitelist. No, we're doing a blacklist pattern. So when you uncheck that UI I said and passwords, there's a list. Don't show this element. So for new elements, no, it won't. And I'll admit that one of the challenges with the web form module is it's very advanced. And when you're doing upgrades or even updates, is definitely worth looking at the notes and reviewing them to make sure if you really don't want new elements added that they're not added. I think it's a process. This is one of these modules that's almost like a subsystem. So I think you have to kind of take some ownership when you're doing the upgrade process. I know that's not the best answer, but it's an acceptable one. Um, Going back, let's see, we got 10 minutes. What's good is I don't have to do Q&A at the end. I do want to leave 5 minutes to do, wrap up. Um, I'm going to I like this functionality. By the way, I think this starts to address no one asked this question. By the way, some of this deck is about answering questions before people are going to ask them. And people are like, what about decoupled forms? There are modules to do REST endpoints for web forms, and you could decouple them in Gatsby integration. The problem is you lose functionality because some of the functionality is tightly coupled to Drupal's render system and form API. But there's the ability to share a web form, to basically take your web form out of Drupal and embed it on any site. This I'm going to demo it and talk more about it. Sharing forms is a module, Webform Share. It adds a share tab that you have to enable for each form for security purposes. And what it gives you is like a JavaScript or an iframe, and that gray box is your web form in an embeddable iframe that can go on any website. It's a resizing iframe. So and you can pick a dedicated theme for that web form that's embedded. So you could, one, have a lightweight theme. This is how almost all enterprise form builders are sharing their forms in an iframe. Because one, you don't get conflicts with JavaScript or CSS bleed through. And it does provide a pretty seamless integration. So if you're doing headless, what you could do is decouple Drupal, decouple the front end, and then still use web forms by just embedding them in your decoupled front end. And it's not a lot of work because all you're doing in a theme or twig is styling a form. You could very simply just take the Bootstrap theme, apply it to this web form, and be pretty much good to go. Um, let's talk about. Okay. Let me see if there's more questions. By the way, you can upvote your own question if I missed it. I think we're good. I like having, this is what's fun is I can jump around. Oh, I see one more. Can you answer 15 look and feel? Yes. That's great. It's good you pointed it out because I am a kind of a back end developer by nature, and I tend not to talk about theming. So this series just talks about you can add classes, styles, and attributes to almost any element in the web form module. So that opens up a lot of capability where you can tweak and adjust your form, changing the look and feel. So basically, we're just looking at the name input where you can say, what's the wrapper? You can add custom attributes to what goes around that input, but then you could take the element and add custom attributes. You could add styles. I use this a lot for margins to add a little extra margin. I will tend to not do it in this space. And frankly, the approach here is I allow things to be customized exactly the same way, but I don't recommend customizing everything here. So you could even do this at the form level to set attributes. But generally, best practice is to add a CSS file or some way to, for your form to adjust things. So the web form module, and there's a tab for CSS and JavaScript. You can add global CSS and JavaScript to every web form. So if you have a front end theme that has some minor issues, you can adjust this using using that tab. But for a web form, you can go in and say, hey, I would like to add this CSS to this form. I'm going to take a form item, put a border on it. So I put the border on and I displayed an alert. This is a nice way you can add custom validation this way. You can also alter behaviors. An example with the JavaScript is, and you know what, since I have the IDE open, I'll try to show you something. So, because this is a really nice advanced feature for people to be aware of. So I go in the JavaScript folder and I look for an element. And by the way, I'm on the 5x version. If I go to the date element, you're going to get this little list of options for the date picker. So let's say you had a date picker on a form and you wanted to change how it's going to work. In the JavaScript section, you could insert these options and then start customizing. And I include documentation so you can go in and say, what you would do is, I don't know. I just want to kind of, oh, I'll make this bigger because I feel like I lose people on these small screens. Go in, you copy this into the UI. You go in and say, well, I would like my options to be, custom something. And you read the documentation, the API documentation. Um, that's a really powerful use for the JavaScript. And by the way, I've moved away from the CSS and the look and feel, but that's kind of like it's kind of, a look and feel is kind of a combination of JavaScript and CSS. Um, let's see what else I can talk about. Got 5 more minutes. I'm going to do one more section. Um, I can talk about templates. I think templates for people who are looking to get started is a good place. They're just copies of forms. So they're forms. You turn on the Web4 templates module, and for trying to improve a user experience, if you don't want users to be overwhelmed, give them a starter form. If users are continually building an event registration form, give them a starter event registration form. It's just a copy. It just makes a copy of a form. The UX is fairly simple. It's a tab. You go in and say, the user can preview. Hey, here's an employee evaluation. You could delete these. I do a lot of healthcare, so this is an example of an appointment form, which it really illustrates some good patterns for conditional logic, collecting hours, and you get a copy of that form for people to start working from. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up. And I will stay on. There's 69 people in the chat, so my policy is to stay on until there's no more questions. Um, but I'm going to wrap up. Sorry, I have to. Oof. Do, 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 do. There we go. We're going to get to the end of getting help. How do you get help with the Webform module? Well, there's documentation, cookbooks. There's a cookbook with recipes. There's screencasts. There's videos throughout the Webform module. Stack Exchange has a lot of discussions going on. And if you find a bug or an issue, or you want to request, make a feature request, you can go into the issue queue. And I've been writing my blog post to Drupal or not to Drupal, and kind of been struggling with my commitment to Drupal, and I kind of have started pushing people to get more involved. And there's actually this triptych in the UI and on the Webform module where I'm suggesting people to get involved, which is always the theme at DrupalCons. You can also help fund development by just using Open Collective. It makes a huge difference. That is literally how I'm sustaining my contributions at this point. If I need to take a half day off of work to make Drush 10 work properly, I'm using funds collected in the Open Collective, and this is what is going to allow the Webform module to be maintained and move forward. And I'm always available to be hired for professional support. Um, and yeah, you can reach me more at jrockwitz.com. And yeah, I just want to reemphasize that. And please post your feedback online, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Um, I will stay on this tab, and I will jump around and answer any questions as they come in. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to look in the chat too. This is one of the problems. You can't do both. Okay. Oh, reCAPTCHA doesn't disable page. That's a great point. Thank you. I have to look into it. Um, by the way, now I'm just reading the comments, which frankly, they're not recorded. So me reading out loud comments is not a bad thing. Mm. Oh, yeah. Someone's talking about using RabbitMQ. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for all the positive feedback. I really am trying to make this just a Q&A where you get something out of it. That's all. That's the biggest accomplishment. There's a ton of features and documentation around it, but I think, you know, getting answers to questions, that's what I like. I always like the Q&A. Okay. Um, I mean, by the way, if people want me just to keep talking, you got me for 15 more minutes. In the chat, you could say, "Can you show more?" I don't care. Um, thank you. Um, funny thing, I'm on a personal note, I'm trying to figure out what to do for DrupalCon North America. It's like, what type of presentation do you follow after all these online presentations? What's the and I've been doing these for a long time. Is there a standard approach to submit? Yeah, we could do the chat. I'll bounce back to the Q&A. Is there a standard approach to submitting forms to other APIs? The remote post is pretty much the standard. Um, in that it has all the functionality that you would push to an API, like whether you package it as a JSON, a form post. The other thing about the data is it will do some casting. It it does set you up for success. Um, at the same time, handlers are fairly simple. So a simple handler might be the best approach for submitting forms to other APIs. I go back and forth on that one. Because one thing I will say about API integration is you want it to be as tight, as stable as possible, so less code is more. So if you create a custom handler that does exactly what you need, and there's an example of custom handlers and how to kind of do that. One thing I will say is that the data is very, very simple. It's not, I mean, composites, which I didn't talk about, can create a lot of nested data. Is 59 people, so I can talk. Oh, wow, yeah, it's funny. There were a lot of questions, so I didn't go through everything. I use the word composite, and I guess some people are still on, so I'm just going to talk about it for a second. A composite element, there's a section. Oh, it jumped around. I'm sorry about that. Um, some good examples: elements, composites, improving the form UX. Well, I'm just going to point out composite elements like an address element, where it's a bunch of inputs working together, and it's better I just show it. By the way, this comes up from the API because that's a challenge. So let's say we had our contact form and we wanted to add an element. I hit preview. It takes a second, by the way, the preview, because I don't have caching turned on in my CSS and JavaScript. This takes a second because it's generating a preview of every element. This is a little slower, by the way. I think the presentation software is not happy with me right now. Here we go. You see when you get to this add name, if I go over to here, you can do a contact. You can add this element, and it's a bunch of inputs working together. So instead of asking your name, company, and email, I get this contact element where I can say name, company, and email, group it together, change the labels required. And by the way, I'm on this sidetrack because of the API integration, because this data gets a little more complex because basically you're nesting data. Oh, we got to say contact, contact, and you get a preview, and you get this massive element at the bottom that allows you to collect multiple data points in one. Hop over to the Q&A tab. Oh, the advanced address. So Matt is asking about, so I'm showing an address element. This is a very simple composite call. There's an address where you're just like collecting very simple data points, but let me kill this one and point out the one that he's asking about. I have the address module enabled on my machine. This preview. This is one of those features that I knew I had to add, but I got to hide it. With the address and module enabled, you get two addresses now. You get a basic or advanced. Advanced is the address module. That's what Commerce Guys built, which is now Centero. I'm going to add it, and you get very limited capabilities where you can just say what the fields are. You can hide, override. To change the labels, you would have to do custom code to alter hook. This is like the out of the box functionality. And what's different is it doesn't show you all the inputs. It actually does some Ajax and validation. So here, At the bottom, I could say I'm from the United States. I'll just pick any country, Grenada, and it will generate a perfect address, and it will validate the postal code based on that information. To change these labels, you got to get into an alter hook and custom code. I bet you in the address modules issue queue, there's people asking questions about that. Going back to the chat. Oh yeah, Daniel's giving me the 5-minute mark. We're gonna get kicked off, which I think is fine. Um, I'm good with that. I actually have to take my dog for a walk in the park. It's still dark here, but he likes going out. Um, what else? I don't know. I think wow, there's still 52 people here, so I'm gonna something it's funny. I answered so many questions. I missed things that I like to highlight. So I'm gonna highlight one final thing is there's a ton of help documentation around the web form module. So if I go up to web forms, there's a dedicated help section that has videos and screencasts walking through every single piece of functionality that we've just talked about, and you can see them in line. Um, and like the example we were talking about, oh, here we can look up composites versus tables. So there's actually capability to build tables. There's a dedicated video talking about what composites are and how to build a table as well. That's another way to control your layout. These are also available inline for example, if you go to the template section, you can watch videos here. Something people don't know is if you don't like what you see here, this video, or you don't want your users to do it, this is an advanced configuration where you can turn on and off actual features in the UI. So I can go over to the advanced section and make decisions like I don't want videos. I would actually like to promote web forms to be a top level toolbar item. I would like to disable the help. And what I'm going to do right now when I hit save is change the full UI. And what's going to happen here is if you have a use case where you're primarily your site, you need your site builders to build forms and you don't want them in structure, this moves that web form section up next to content. So web forms kind of becomes like a content task on your site. Um, by the way, it's rebuilding the menus, but now we have a dedicated section for web forms. And you'll notice when I go that help is totally removed with the videos no longer there. Also simplifies your UI. We are at time. Yeah. Yeah, the help page is helpful for clients. At the same time, it's a very tricky, debatable one. Some clients use it, some clients don't. Um, these are all easy things to turn on and off um, in the UI. And one thing is, I think the help tab's only available to advanced site builders. That's kind of one of the concepts. You see all this functionality because I'm logged in as an admin. As you're not, if you're not administer web form level permission, you don't have that permission to administer web forms, you see a lot less. It dramatically gets dropped down to basically forms, templates, and submissions. Um, all right, I'm going to end on a slide. Ah, the self promotion. You can learn more about me at jrockwitz.com, on Drupal.org. I have a blog. I talk about things. You can learn more. Um, the Q&A is done. Yep, I've answered all the questions. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of this event and have a really nice, I hope you had a good time. Okay, I'm signing off.